Right, for my last lecture, I'm going to talk about voluntary action in the British welfare state. And I need to begin by defining what I'm going to talk about, because the term voluntary action covers a lot of different kinds of activity, and it's changed its character in many ways over time, or some aspects have. And even the language we use to describe it changes. And broadly what I'm talking about is non-state action, action that isn't funded mainly or driven completely by the state. Though even that boundary has become less certain in recent years. And it's broadly action that's dedicated to improving conditions in society. But that obviously can cover a wide range of different kinds of activity. And also the kind of organisations I'm talking about, though in the past they were often staffed by people who were not paid, who literally were volunteering, working in their own time. Increasingly, these organisations, as they grow, become professionalised and employ paid workers. So perhaps the term non-governmental organisations, NGOs, is a better general term because it covers both voluntary action and paid action. It's a term that in English we used to apply only to overseas aid organisations, but increasingly it's applied to organisations within the country. But other terms are used, sometimes civil society organisations. It's a very broad term. The previous government, Labour government, started to refer to the third sector of social action. On the one hand, there was the state action, then there's the private market, but the third sector is the non-governmental voluntary sector. But that term has never come into very common use. And also, we need to distinguish between formal, organised action through institutions, associations, and more informal action within the family or the community, which normally will be unpaid and is not organised by any institution. So we need to keep these distinctions between formal and informal action in mind. So it's a very complicated sector, but I think a very important one in providing for welfare. And there really are no good typologies of different kinds of non-governmental action. There have been attempts by social scientists, but not very successfully. So it's a difficult and complex field. So what kinds of activities do these organisations involve themselves in? Again, they're very varied in their size and in what they aim to do. But the activities can include helping refugees from other countries with various kinds of crisis, supporting disabled or older people or children or any group in need, improving the environment in various ways, campaigning to improve services, both local and national. Some organisations are very local, concerned with local community issues. Others are national, others are international. So again, it's a very varied sector. It's sometimes believed that this kind of non-governmental action must have declined in size and importance with the growth of welfare states, that state welfare has crowded out voluntary action. It's claimed, for example, by the new Conservative British government that because voluntary action has been declining, it wants to promote what it calls the big society, which it sees as opposed to the big state. It believes that the state has grown big and society has grown much smaller, and with it, voluntary action. As I'll try to argue, they're quite wrong, and voluntary non-governmental action has remained very strong, certainly in Britain, through the period of growth of a welfare state. And non-governmental and state action work together and have always worked together. They depend on one another and are complementary rather than opposed to one another. It's in fact quite hard to measure change over time because many organisations don't have very good records. And it's also difficult to know what is to be measured. Does one measure action of this kind by the amount of their funds or by the number of people involved? It's in fact because their activities are very varied, and helping people, sometimes informally, is not easy to measure. It's very difficult to have systematic measures of change over time. I think all we can say is that voluntary action remains very strong by recent measures. For example, the United Kingdom Home Office surveyed involvement in non-governmental action in 2003 and found that almost 40% of adults in England and Wales had volunteered in a formal organisation at least once in the previous year, and many others had worked informally with their family members or the community. So the signs are quite strong that this kind of activity, and it's also true if we look at the number of organisations, that this kind of activity continues to be very strong in the modern welfare state. And that what has actually emerged over the history of the welfare state is not a big state which has destroyed non-governmental action, but what has been called a mixed economy of welfare, that we don't have simple state welfare, but a mixed economy in which there are important contributions to welfare by the state, also by the family and the community, also by the voluntary sector, and lastly also by employers. And all four of these groups make important contributions and complement one another in different ways. So I think thinking about a mixed economy of welfare rather than a big society in conflict with a big state is much more realistic and helpful. And to give an example of how important family care is, the role of the family is often very much underestimated in Britain, but many services assume that families do a great deal of caring, in particular that women in families will do a lot of unpaid care for children, for older people, for disabled people. And it was estimated in the late 1990s that the annual value of family care for older people was £24 billion in 1 year, whereas state care cost only £4 billion, which is much less. I haven't seen more recent statistics, but I doubt that it's changed a very great deal. The family is still a very important contributor, though its value can be hard to estimate because it's so often hidden. As I've already said, in 2003, almost 40% of adults were engaged in formal action. It's also a pity that there's a lack of good comparisons across different countries. Even within Western Europe, we don't have good comparisons of voluntary action. It's clear that there is quite a lot of it in most Western countries, but the studies have not really been made. I think for a long time, historians particularly concentrated on the growth of the state and haven't looked so much at voluntary action. And similarly, social scientists have not made many comparisons across countries. But from what we do know, it seems to continue to be an important aspect of most modern societies. Voluntary action of various kinds has a long history in the United Kingdom, from the very earliest times that we can trace. In particular, in medieval times, the church had a very important role in helping poor people, sick people, and also the monarchy, the crown, and big landowners had an obligation to help their subjects and also to secure their power by being seen to help their subjects and to help to make them loyal to them. From 1601, as I mentioned last week, the state provided support for the poorest people in society. It was very basic support for people who couldn't work and had no other source of help. If they had families able to help them, then the family was obliged by law to support their members. And this continued to be so until 1948. Indeed, it's still true in some other West European countries that families are obliged by law to help family members who need welfare assistance. Also, the poor law worked in a complementary relationship with voluntary charity, with the churches. Very often the local poor law was run by the minister of the local church. And so deserving poor people would be advised to go to a local charity rather than receive poor relief. So there's always been a mixed economy of welfare throughout British history, with an emphasis on the family and on voluntary charity and on state public action. And they've always been seen as working together. So carrying on looking at the history of voluntary action, it particularly expanded as the British economy grew with industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries. The words that were most commonly used then were charity or philanthropy, which mean much the same thing. They're words that describe people giving their money and their time to help people in need. And it grew as the country grew more prosperous and more people had money to spare to give to others, and also time to spare. And also for a growing middle class, being involved in charitable activity was a way of securing their social status. It was a way they made contact with other influential people. It's also important that with the growth of the middle class, there were more women available who became the main volunteers, the people most involved in these new kinds of organizations. Because women of the middle and upper classes were not allowed to work for pay once they were married, but many of them wanted to do something with their lives and be useful. And so being involved in charitable work, helping poorer people in various ways, was an important contribution that many of them made to society, often driven by religious belief, but often also by wanting to fill their time and help other people, which they did in a variety of ways. There were organizations providing for all children, for disabled people, for old people, again, or just for people who were very poor and needed some kind of help. So for a long time, it was women who were the backbone of voluntary organizations. But these organizations, as well as providing for the needs of poorer people, also increasingly campaigned for more state action. Because one of the roles that these organizations played in the 19th century and up to the present has been to identify certain kinds of social need that have not been provided for, and then invent ways of providing for people in need. And they realized that the voluntary sector on its own couldn't provide for example, all the children in need, or all the education children needed. Only the state had the resources to do this. So they campaigned for more state action. One obvious example of this is the growth of education in the 19th century. At the beginning of the century, education for working class children was provided mainly by churches for quite few children, because there were limits to how much the churches could do. And firstly, the state subsidized church schools so they could expand. But then, at the end of the century, in 1880, when the state wanted everyone to have an education, because it's good for the economy if everyone is educated, then the state took over and provided schools for everyone who did not have a school. So what starts as voluntary action is gradually then taken over and expanded by the state. And this was what many voluntary organisations campaigned for. So again, they don't see themselves as opposed to the state, but as encouraging state action and working with it. And as state welfare grew from the end of the 19th century, it was very closely coordinated with voluntary action. I've given the examples of education, but we can see this same pattern in all of the early areas of expansion of the welfare state in Britain. For example, the first laws to protect children from cruelty and abuse in the home and elsewhere, a voluntary organisation, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, was set up in the early 1880s. And it was set up because people had identified a serious problem of children being badly treated, but the parents or the other people who were cruel to them were not being punished, and no one was looking after the children. So the organisation was set up to try to solve this problem. It campaigned for the state to act, and the result was government legislation in 1889, which for the first time punished people who were cruel to children, including their own children, and also provided to have the children looked after, normally by voluntary organisations. So the law provides that voluntary organisations must look after children in need of protection. And the government subsidised these organisations. And there are similar patterns, for example, when old age pensions were introduced for the first time in 1908. It's again voluntary organisations who identify the fact that there are many old people, particularly old women, who were very poor. And they were poor not through their own fault. They'd worked hard, but they'd never earned enough money to save. And they were poor. Their families couldn't help them, perhaps because they had no family. Their children might have died, or they might never have married, and many people didn't marry. Or their families might be too poor to help them, which often happened. And so they identified a real problem of poverty in old age that the Poor Law didn't provide for adequately. So it campaigned for the state to provide pensions. pensions were introduced in 1908 for very poor old people only. But then they were administered by voluntary organisations, by committees composed of volunteers from trade unions and other local organisations. So the government pays for the pensions, puts them in place, but the administration, that is interviewing old people to see whether they're poor enough, is left to volunteers. And the same was true when National Health and Unemployment Insurance was introduced in 1911. It's set up by the state, which sets up a structure where employers and workers contribute to a national insurance system for health and unemployment. And the state contributes to the benefits, but it is administered, and the benefits are paid by trade unions, friendly societies, and other voluntary organisations. So again, we see a mixed economy of welfare in being, the state working with voluntary organisations. The same was true when maternal and child welfare begins to improve. Organisations, mainly women's organisations, campaign because of the high level of infant death rates and death rates among mothers. They want more clinics, more healthcare provision for them. Set up their own private clinics, voluntary clinics, but want the state to act because it can help all mothers and children. And then gradually the state provided more welfare centres, funded more welfare centres through the 1920s and 30s. Obviously it was much cheaper for government if they could get voluntary organisations to administer welfare services. It's cheaper than paying people to do it themselves. And this was an important part of the motivation. But there was also a strong belief in government, in a mixed economy of welfare, that it should be a mixture of state action and voluntary action, and wherever possible, family and community action. It's part of an early 20th century liberal ideology. And the state of welfare expanded in the 1920s and 30s, as I described last week. It takes this form of the state, of voluntary organisations, again campaigning on new issues to encourage more state action, which is followed by state action, but partly administered by voluntary organisations, subsidised, partly funded by the state. Then after 1945, as I described last time, the Labour government introduced what we see as the modern welfare state, with a national health service where a state-run organisation took over what had been partly a voluntary service before. It introduced state pensions, health benefits, unemployment benefits, all of which were now administered by the state and not by voluntary organisations. William Beveridge, who wrote an important report in 1942, is always seen as having been an important influence on the 1945 welfare state. And in many ways he was an important influence. But in many other ways, his ideas were rejected by the Labour government. In particular, Beveridge had always believed in a mixed economy of welfare. Politically, he was a liberal, and he's believed and wrote in his report of 1942 that the state should provide enough for everyone in need to live on. It should provide a safety net to prevent people falling into destitution. But the state should not provide more than that. It should provide a minimum, a safety net. If people wanted more, then they should save, or their family should help them, or voluntary action should help. Beveridge wrote a book in 1948 called Voluntary Action, which was arguing very strongly that in a good society, voluntary action played a big part. And Beveridge had always argued that from the beginning of the 20th century, that a good society was one in which people who had money and time to spare voluntarily gave it to people in need. And this would help to build closer social relationships. But Labour didn't share this vision of a mixed economy. The party was much more hostile to what it thought of as charity. And it was a party dedicated to improving the conditions of working people. It was the first time it was in government with a majority. And it knew that many working people regarded voluntary action as rather demeaning. Charity was not good. They felt badly treated by charitable organisations and believed that the state was a more humane way to provide. So in principle, Labour believed more in state action rather than voluntary action. But even they couldn't believe in this completely or carry it out completely, because the state could just not afford to provide for everybody's needs. Particularly, the economy was not in great shape after a war. So although Labour aspired for the state to provide for all kinds of need, in reality, it couldn't do it. And so voluntary action continued in the welfare state. At first, after 1945, existing voluntary organisations were rather weak. They weren't sure whether they had a future, because if the state was really going to provide for everybody, there was no need for voluntary action. And also, it was hard for them to get funds. Taxes were high at this time. So people with surplus income, well, these people didn't have so much surplus income. And also, people believed that the welfare state had got rid of poverty, and so there was no need for charitable voluntary action any longer. But very soon, in fact, new organisations grew up, partly because people very quickly realised there were gaps in the welfare state, people whose needs were not being felt. For example, the mentally ill were not well provided for by the National Health Service in its early years. It got much better later, but initially the mentally ill were left out. And so a number of organisations were formed in the late 1940s to campaign for equal and better treatment for mentally ill people. And a number of organisations that still exist were set up. For example, an association of parents of what were then called backward children, later called mentally handicapped children, was formed in 1946 because it was found that children who had mental problems, there was no adequate provision for their education or their treatment. And also, just after the war, the National Association for Mental Health was set up to campaign for all mentally ill people. And both of these organisations still exist under different names. And similarly, there were organisations set up to campaign for improved care for older people, because it was felt that they were being neglected. They had better pensions, but those who needed care had not very good care. So what was happening after 1945 was the state responsibility for welfare grew. But instead of displacing voluntary action, it encouraged new kinds of voluntary action, because people recognized there were weaknesses in the welfare state and campaigned for ways of putting those weaknesses right. So again, we see the mixed economy in action. A growing state encourages voluntary action because it makes people critical. It raises people's expectations, for one thing, of what the state can do, and they demand even more. So again, state and society are not conflicting, but are working in similar directions. The state didn't always welcome, government didn't always welcome such criticism, but generally listened to it, and policy responded. I saw a growth of voluntary action through the 1950s for this kinds of reason, that people became increasingly aware that the welfare state had not solved every problem. It had done a lot of good, but there were very big gaps. And there was continuing poverty. At first it was assumed that the poverty that continued in the welfare state was just among old people. But then in the early 1960s, researchers investigated the extent of poverty and found that there was still a lot of it. It's described as rediscovery of poverty. It was a different kind of poverty, and there are interesting discussions at this time about how you define poverty in a more developed economy. The kind of poverty that the researchers were discovering in the 1960s was not the kind of total destitution that poverty researchers had discovered at the beginning of the 20th century. The first big surveys of poverty in Britain and other European countries came around the beginning of the 20th century, and they did find up to 30% of people in London living in real destitution, without enough money always to eat, for shelter, for heating. By the 1950s and 60s, this kind of absolute poverty has pretty much disappeared. The success of the welfare state and a growing economy was to provide the safety net that Beveridge had recommended, that most people had enough to live on. But what poverty came to mean now was that as society was getting richer, most people were getting better off. The people at the bottom were left further and further behind. So poverty is defined no longer as just not having enough to live on, but as not having enough to live a life that's comparable with that of other people in society. The children have much poorer clothes, that the family has no holidays, no leisure activities. It's not expecting a very high standard, but it is saying that if people lag too far behind everyone else, then that can be defined as poverty. So under this new definition, it was found that quite a lot of people were living in poverty, and particularly larger families, so children in larger families were particularly defined as victims of poverty. And there was a big campaign in the 1960s about the extent of child poverty. And this rediscovery of poverty led to the emergence of new kinds of non-governmental organisations, more professionalised than earlier voluntary organisations, very often using paid workers and trained workers, making a lot of use of newspapers and modern media to promote their cause, and also very often encouraging the people on whose behalf they're campaigning to participate. Whereas previous organisations had been rather top-down, that is, charitable people working on behalf of disabled people, mentally ill people, old people, children. Now there's a greater desire to draw these people into the movements and the campaigns. So that by the 1970s, for example, there were disabled people demonstrating in their wheelchairs for greater benefits and improved legislation, which would not have happened at any earlier period. So it's a new kind of approach that a new kind of organisation set up. And the first of these were dealing with child poverty. The Child Poverty Action Group was set up in the late 1960s to campaign for more state benefits for families with poor families with children. And the Child Poverty Action Group is still very active in support of poorer families. Homelessness was another big issue that was discovered. And homelessness not just of single men, but sometimes of families because they were poor. And an organisation called Shelter was established in the late 60s, and it still exists. As I've said, there are organisations set up to campaign for the disabled. So a new model, really, of a new kind of more professionalised, more public, often campaigning more dramatically and noisily than older organisations, come into being from the 1960s, and generally led in the late 60s and 70s to changes in legislation to provide more housing. Local authorities were obliged to give homes to the homeless. There were improved child benefits, for example. They were quite effective organisations and continue to be. And many of the older organisations, for example, those campaigning for unmarried mothers or older people, mentally ill people, changed their methods to become more like these new organisations. And it's coming about for a number of reasons. One was a disappointment with the post-war welfare state and a feeling that there must be pressure on government to make it better, particularly because society was more prosperous by the 1960s. And also because society is more prosperous, these organisations can be funded by private donors. More people can afford to contribute because it's not more expensive to run these organisations, particularly with paid workers. There was a Labour government from 1964 to 1970. It had been out of office through the 1950s, and when it came back, it wanted to build the welfare state further to repair some of the gaps. So it was responsive to these campaigns. It's also important at this time that more social policy and social work professionals were being trained in universities. So people are coming out of university wanting to use this training in a useful way, and very often do it by going into these organisations. Some go into local authority services or government services, but others are the campaigners in the new organisations. And society by the 1960s was generally better educated, less deferential and more critical of government. And so also were the press and the mass media. They were more likely to be critical, more willing to take up these kinds of campaigns. So there are important social and cultural changes that come together. And of course, it's a period in the late 60s and 70s of international radicalism, particularly among young people. So there are other kinds of voluntary actions going on that some social scientists call new social movements. Again, campaigns designed to make society more equal and improve social conditions, but in different ways from the old charities. Things like the Women's Liberation Movement, which campaigned for gender equality. There were also welfare changes like more childcare, which they see as essential to equality. The Gay Liberation Front demanding equality for homosexuals with the rest of society, anti-racist movements. And this all led to more government action in the late 1960s. A Race Relations Act outlawing race discrimination, the legalization of homosexual acts, a Sex Discrimination Act outlawing certain forms of discrimination against, on grounds of gender, against men or women. So it's a new kind of, sometimes quite noisy and dramatic, voluntary action, which I think helps to stimulate some of the other organisations that I've been talking about. Because alongside these new social movements, then old forms of movement either continue in being or are coming into being all of the time. There are new organisations being formed as new kinds of problems are identified and people campaign about them, which might be something very local, where groups of people get together to campaign about, say, stopping a local library closing or some other kind of very local issue. There are more self-help groups, which are groups of people with particular problems getting together to campaign about them rather than looking to other people to do the campaigning. For example, Gingerbread, which was founded in 1970, was a group formed by a single mother to get together other single mothers to talk about the problems they felt they had in common and to campaign for the state to do something about it. And the government at this time had a major investigation in progress looking at the circumstances of lone mothers, which did recommend more state help for them. And that's just one of many. There are similar groups among disabled people, for example, other mentally ill people, or parents of people with particular kinds of problems. So this is something different again from the kind of organisation that's set up by people who want to help others. This is people who want to get together to help themselves. And as I said, new issues keep emerging that people campaign on. For example, in the late 1970s, 1980s, there was a movement to move more mentally ill people out of hospitals into their own homes in the community, where they were supposed to get support from local services. And many of them did, but many of them did not, and services in some places were inadequate. And so campaigning for better services to support mentally ill people or other disabled people in the community becomes important. And some of these organisations are quite short-lived. They might achieve what they want and then give up. Others become lasting bodies. But they're, again, very important parts of society and can again be seen as part of this mixed economy of welfare. Then in the 1980s, there were Conservative governments led by Margaret Thatcher, which was anxious, if it could, to cut back the welfare state and encourage private action, including voluntary action, in as many ways as possible, including devolving state services to voluntary organisations or NGOs. This was unpopular with many people, but that included many people in the voluntary sector. They were happy to work with the state, but they felt they didn't have the resources to take over important activities from the state. They'd campaigned for the state to take on a lot of activities because only it had the resources of income and people to administer the best kinds of services. Voluntary sector was not big enough or well funded enough. And as I said, they saw their role as supplementing and helping to improve state welfare, but not as replacing it. their vision was of the state and the voluntary sector working together, whereas the Conservative vision was rather of the voluntary sector replacing the state sector, which did not seem realistic to the voluntary sector itself. But the Conservative government went some way in cutting state services, but could never go as far as it hoped. But it did, in some areas particularly, expand and subsidize NGOs to take over certain services. This is particularly true in the housing sector, but it is true in some other areas too. On the other hand, it wasn't in favour of all voluntary organisations, and it did cut funds to those it thought was too critical or too radical. And the problem with the government subsidising voluntary action is that with government funds always comes government control. And that was the other thing the voluntary sector didn't like. It wanted to be independent of the state and able to be critical of the state. And it didn't want the kind of limitations on its action that come with increased government funding. Governments don't give money away unconditionally. There are almost always conditions. And that limits the freedom of organisations who believe in their own freedom. So new kinds of tensions emerged. Then from 1997 to earlier this year, 2010, there were Labour governments. And these also encouraged and subsidised NGOs, again, sometimes controlling them too much, doing this because it was often cheaper than increasing state action. But at the same time, they did expand state welfare in many ways, repairing some of the damage that had been done previously, for example, to the health sector, to the health service and the education service. A great deal more money went into both health and education, and to improvements in benefits to pensioners and lower paid families. But they were also consciously encouraging what they increasingly called the third sector, the non-governmental sector. I think very much aware that welfare was a mixed economy, but not just promoting the state, promoting both state and the voluntary sector working together. But again, with government funds to NGOs came government conditions. And it does raise a big question of whether non-governmental organisations, at what point do non-governmental organisations cease to be non-governmental if they're getting a lot of government funding and are having to obey government rules and spending that funding. And that is, I think, a real dilemma. Then earlier this year we got a new Conservative government, and as I said earlier, David Cameron, well, a Conservative-led government, it's supposed to be a coalition. The Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, keeps talking about encouraging a big society, which he sees as being opposed to the kind of big state that he says Labour wanted. And as we've seen, Labour's view was more complicated than that. And the big society and the big state have tended to work together, not to be opposed. And in fact, nobody seems quite to understand what he means by the term big society. Partly, on one hand, they just don't understand it, or they know that all of these things are already going on is implying that there's been a great decline in voluntary action, but clearly there hasn't, and most people know there hasn't. And that's why it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. There's also lots of talk by this government about community control, local communities somehow taking control of all kinds of local services, not only libraries, but they've even suggested prisons and police stations, which is a bit hard to imagine. Somehow assuming that services now run by the state can be run by local, not necessarily very well qualified people. But at the same time, funding to local government is being cut, and local authorities give a lot of funding to voluntary organisations. So some government actions are actually harming existing voluntary organisations. I think one last point that's worth looking at is to ask who participates in voluntary, non-governmental organisations. Although, as I've said, non-governmental organisations have become increasingly professional, especially since the 1960s. Many of them still make a lot of use of volunteers. And as I suggested at the beginning, there's still a lot of volunteering, both in the formal, organised NGO sector and informally in the family and community. Up to the 1950s, most volunteers were women, especially middle and upper class women. But then it became possible for them to get paid work, and many of them, in fact, preferred to train to be social workers and become paid social workers rather than unpaid ones, but they could also go into other occupations. There was then a tendency to encourage young people to volunteer part-time. In recent years, the main volunteers have become older, retired people. There are now more people over 60, 65 who are retired from work, but are still very active and energetic and want to do something with their lives. There are also people often with a lot of skill. A retired doctor, a retired teacher, a retired engineer, a retired accountant or businessman has got extremely useful skills for the voluntary sector, very much more useful than an 18 or 20-year-old who's just left school or university. And there are a lot of elder people, retired people volunteering in poorer countries in Africa and elsewhere. Again, something that used to be done only by very young people. At least 30% of overseas volunteers are now people over 60. And again, they could be a great deal more useful given their experience and skills. I think some voluntary organisations have been very slow to recognise this and think there's something wrong if they're only getting old people and not young people retiring, volunteering. But I think they're coming to realise that people may be over 60, but they're not dead yet, and they do have a lot of skills. And in fact, the recent official statistics show that 27% of people over 60 are active in formal volunteering. But again, many of them are informally active within their families, within their local communities. So to conclude, there have always been a lot of forms of voluntary action. and it continues to be strong. Voluntary action hasn't been crowded out by the growth of a welfare state. Voluntary action and state action have always worked together and been complementary. And I think it's helpful to think of a mixed economy of welfare and remember the importance of the voluntary, non-governmental sector, the family and community sector, and the state, rather than seeing them as opposed to one another. Okay, thank you.